Our next game is Panzer Dragoon Saga, developed by Team Andromeda and published by Sega. Although I think Team Andromeda is basically a Sega team, so that kind of basically Sega here. It was released on the Sega Saturn, but you probably know that because it's the most famous Saturn game pretty much ever released. It was nominated to us by @Canenzo and Mindbender333, and Mindbender was iTunes. Its earliest release date and territory was January 29th, 1998 in Japan. I saw a very, very limited Western release that I've read is basically only 20,000 copies spread out across English-speaking territories, and they were subtitled in English rather than translated with voice actors, which is very uncommon for a game of its time. Very cool stuff. And to help us out on this one is theGunheart, who also played through this one. Panzer Dragoon Saga. What does anyone think about this one?
Okay,
this game really freaking rocks.
Yeah, I just want to come in hot right now. This game is better than FF7, and I'm not sorry.
One thing is that that amazes me still is that it had a serious uphill battle. And right from the get-go, it's a role-playing game based on 2 wheeler shooters. And second, it has the honor of having had 4 discs worth of story to a game series that's plot was usually limited to the intro and ending.
Although the previous Panzer Dragoon games did infer a really interesting world, which it was one of the reasons those games were popular, at least in the sense that when you looked at them, when you played them, you're like, wow, this seems like a really cool sense of place and universe. And so when Sega released Saga and they're just like, and now there's actual plot, it's like, wow, I can actually learn about the world that these games took place in. Although I don't know if they're strictly kind of slightly retconned, because I'm not quite sure how they all fit together. Do they fit together perfectly? I don't think they do.
I can't quite remember the exact details, but the timeline goes the second game, the first game, and Saga. In fact, Saga even has it actually has the airship that you're chasing in the second Panzer Dragoon, and it still has the wings blown off of it that you blew up in Panzer Dragoon 2.
I do understand that the dragon is different but same, and it's like reincarnated or something between the games. As far as the plot goes, it's very curious sort of character, because the games don't feature the same characters, correct? This has a whole new cast.
It's a new idol every game.
So does anyone want to throw at me the plot? Because we mentioned the Empire. You play as a fairly bland guy who is deliberately bland because he's just kind of like the main character, and he's kind of you in the game world.
Basically, in this one, plotline is that it's the post-apocalypse. An evil empire is digging up ancient artifacts from before the apocalypse, etc. Okay, it's been a while since I've actually played the first 2.
I can try to explain the plot of this game if you want.
Go for it.
So basically, you're this bland guy named Edge. That's the default name anyway. I don't think you can change it.
I love that your name's Edge. That's such a stupid name.
It's not that edgy, so...
Funnily enough, the first one, actually, in the first game's protagonist was actually named Kyle. I mean, that just sounds so out of place given the art direction to have such a normal name.
Right, because this game has this really bizarre feature where they invented a whole language to use in the opening cutscene and then switched back to Japanese for the rest of the game, which is bizarre. Panzer Dragoonese, I think, is the made-up language that's in the opening cutscene, but for the rest of it, it's not.
Anyway, to recap the intro real quick, so these Empire guys show up at the mine Edge is guarding. They kill all his friends there, and Edge falls into like a disused mine shaft where he finds this dragon, and so he and the dragon bond, and they go off to basically just fight the Empire.
But there's a lot more to it with this game, right? Because there's a lady that's in stone.
A little bit off, because you're not fighting the Empire at the start. You're fighting a rogue element of the Empire. You're actually working for the Empire at the start of the game. You're a mercenary hired to guard one of their, what's it?
Yeah, it's one of their mining sites.
Their excavation sites, where they excavate the technology from the old world.
One thing I really like it feels like the plot is much more condensed and it goes by much more quickly than most other RPGs of the time. Like, a lot of the most really important stuff, it's all FMV cutscenes, and those are pretty nice to watch.
Of FMV cutscenes in this game.
And everything else, like all the world building, just comes like one big chunk that you're just free to skip entirely if you so choose. So it's a very fast-paced story, and I do appreciate that a lot.
It does slow down a bit in Disc 2, though, where, one, there are a ton of side quests you can easily miss because they require talking to the NPCs over and over long after their dialogue has started looping. And they introduce a town that you can explore, and the most plot-relevant NPC is on the opposite corner of the starting point after a really long, space-filling path with no shortcuts.
So you were saying the game gets a lot worse after the first disc, right?
I wouldn't say it gets worse, it's just that it introduces one element that slows things down quite a bit.
And I guess we should probably explain that this game is not a typical JRPG. The way the game is laid out, the way that the mechanics work, this is very unusual. Your main form of traversal is you actually fly around on the dragon, and you go through your areas flying around on the dragon, somewhat similar to the original Panzer Dragoon titles. You can lock onto things, but instead of it being enemies in this case, it's actually just items and objects of interest.
The environments in this game are pretty boring. There's no real dungeons or anything. It's basically just like...
That only really applies to the first disc. The areas get more elaborate as the game progresses.
Oh, I was not aware of that. I only really played the end of the first disc, so...
Shh. So, this game, it has you flying around on the dragon, and it gets increasingly complicated, but there's also a town mode, which takes a much more normal JRPG sort of approach. You walk around towns. The difference in this game is, unlike Final Fantasy VII and a lot of other JRPGs, Sega, even though the whole game is full of rendered FMVs, they made pretty much the whole actual real-time game is 3D. Like, everything is just real-time 3D. Kind of dicey to attempt on the Saturn, and they pulled it off pretty well, because they used pretty much every trick that Sega had figured out for the Saturn to date. And it had a long development time. This game was started development in 96 and only came out in 98, so that's a pretty long tail on this one.
Also unusual is the fact that even on foot you use the lock-on cursor to interact with things, which kind of gives it a bit of a point-and-click feel.
When you aren't wandering around and sort of talking to NPCs repeatedly to trigger conversations, that's a weird one. You fight things in the random generated battle system, which is kind of unique because, firstly, the grinding in this game is kind of deliberately guided. There's not an unlimited amount of enemies. You just gradually run out of enemies in an area, so the game doesn't really let you grind to indefinitely, which is really cool. And the actual battle system is a translation of the Panzer Dragoon previous games into an real-time sort of RPG format, which is really cool.
The interesting thing is that kind of inverts how Panzer Dragoon's battles normally work, where enemies surround you and you aim at them, and that you flank around your enemies here.
May I talk about the battle systems? I actually really do like this game's battle system.
Sure.
Okay, well, it's kind of an active turn-based kind of thing. You've got 3 meters, and for each one that fills up slowly over time, you get 1 action. You can use your dragon to launch a homing attack that hits multiple enemies. You can use your laser gun to hit 1 enemy. But the really cool thing is that you can actually rotate around the enemies, and enemies do have different attacks and patterns depending on where you are in position to them. So you have to constantly stay moving and just pay attention to where the enemies are moving, and it really makes you actually think about what you're doing, not just fight, item, magic, fight, item.
And it's important because the enemies do have weak points that you can only hit from certain angles. So you're maneuvering around them, they're maneuvering around you, and you're trying to hit their weak points but stay out of their more powerful attack areas. And there's a very cool rhythm to this pseudo real-time thing. And to make it slightly more interesting, you do have a whole host of spells. The downside, and I think this was a downside that people looked at the time as well, it doesn't have a party system, really. You are just your dude, Mr. Edge, and the dragon, and he's riding the dragon, so you basically have one character at any one time. There's no extra party members, which is a little bit of surprise, but makes the game feel unique and different.
There are some NPCs that will ride along with you, but none of them have any gameplay consequence.
But I don't mind the single party thing so much because it makes fights go a lot faster. Fights do tend to go pretty fast in this game, like especially if there was like a weak point you can just hit the enemy with and they just die. I love that.
That said, I do admit I'm a little disappointed at the magic system, since more often than not I find that just the homing laser or gun will take care of anything that you without having to spend your magic points on, which you can instead use to heal. Oh, another thing worth noting is that after the second main field area, you gain the ability to allocate your dragon's abilities in one of 4 different categories. And the cool thing is that this isn't a permanent change, irreversible change. You can change out the dragon and your dragon's stats even during battle, and it even comes with this cool real-time morphing effect. So, like, if you would switch to attack, and if you would put more points in attack, the dragon's horn will lengthen and the claws will get sharper. If you would switch to the fence, it will get this hammerhead helmet, the tail gets more armored, etc.
Do you think that enhances the game's replay value, or is it more of a fun gimmick? Because I don't know how often you'd have replayed this game. It's not the longest game, though. It's much shorter.
It's not really much of a replay mechanic because, again, you're not encouraged to stay in any one form. Like, for example, there are some enemies that are, say, immune to lasers, so since the attack mode only affects your dragon's lasers, it's pointless to stay in that mode. And also interestingly is that you can actually max out 2 of the dragon's abilities at any given time, at the cost of drastically reducing 2 other stats. So, like, attack is opposite of your magic, speed is opposite of your defense, and
it's a really, really, like, cool way to approach a RPG battle system that's not the same. Like, they really went, okay, you got the dragon, and you're just going to have the dragon, so we need to really work this and make something interesting. And I think they succeeded on that one. They definitely made this game feel completely different. And it also helps because the game world is thoroughly interesting. You know, it's, as Jeff had mentioned, this game is a post-apocalyptic game, so it feels kind of interesting compared to a lot of other JRPGs which don't actually take place kind of post-apocalyptic.
One thing I think that's interesting to note about the post-apocalyptic setting is the fact that even the pre-disaster world is incredibly alien-looking. I mean, this game could easily take place on some Star Wars alien planet, and you'd probably never know.
Yeah, that's really... They built a really interesting world for Panzer Dragoon and Panzer Dragoon Saga, but a lot of it is hard to communicate, I think, especially in the real-time 3D. You can see the concept art for this game. Its follow-up, kinda, Panzer Dragoon Order has a lot more realization of the world that they might have been kind of looking for. So I guess that's kind of like a strength and a weakness, that it does have this idea of a really grandiose, unique, sort of sci-fi apocalypse fantasy world. Something that maybe someone like Mobius might have penned, but a little bit of it doesn't come through because, you know, it's running 3D on the Saturn. There's only so much that it can give you.
Though I do have to, again, give props to the art direction for repeating some motifs to really communicate on aspects. Like, you can easily tell what sort of the ancient technology and such are by the use of that and that creepy, still white and black color scheme, or the way the Empire's technology all has aspects of the ancient world's tech, but typically in this scavenger world look bolted onto it.
I think it's really it's a very well realized sort of environment and world, which is it's really cool looking stuff. I think we should probably move on to trying to place this game somewhere in our list. Does anyone have anything else to add before we do that?
It would be somewhat remiss not to mention the ridiculous aftermarket value of Panzer Dragoon Saga. And I thought
you were going to mention the music, because the music's pretty good.
The music's pretty good. I honestly don't think it's as good a soundtrack as the original Panzer Dragoon, but it's actually quite good.
I have to agree on that. The only other issue I'd also have is that it is incredibly easy. I mean, while you do have to pay attention in every battle, you can't just smash one button and get through everything. It's still, if you are paying attention, it's almost impossible to die.
Almost all three Saturn Panzer Dragoon games seem to suffer from being too easy. I feel like they wanted you to finish them.
Old as hell.
You think so? I thought they were short and not particularly hard, especially compared to other sort of shmups and things at the time, which were kind of always.
I know I could beat Storefront 64 pretty much blindfolded, but I could barely get through either of the first two Panzer Dragoons.
It feels like it's harder to dodge things in Panzer Dragoon.
Yeah, that's the big thing.
You just got to get used to not being able to move. Yes.
To give an idea for a ranking, I'm thinking between Robotron and Drill Dozer.
I would just caution you guys about just because it's super rare and it's pretty good, being a pretty good game that's super rare isn't necessarily a perfect game. But I don't think that's where you guys were going anyway, so that's okay.
No, the rarity of this game helps to make it evoke a sort of mythical status
and kind of thing, basically.
And it's all because the Saturn itself as a system was kind of on no one's radar, and then a few dozen people that actually owned one were like, yeah, but Radiant Silvergun is the best shmup ever, and Panzer Dragoon is the best RPG ever, and it's okay, guys, cool, that's great. I'm sure that's why the Saturn sold hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars worth.
Just for the sake of argument, and for the sake of our listeners' wallets, although I would recommend this game if there's a way you can find to play it that's not that's more or less tolerable. It probably is cheaper to buy I would say probably a Japanese Saturn, or any Saturn maybe, and then mod it than it is to buy this game.
So they did manage to get the Saturn CD drive to accept different kinds of discs now, didn't they?
Yes, you can pirate games on your Saturn if you tool around with it in a particular fashion. It's not usually recommended because the laser and the track tend to work a bit too hard. It's a problem that CD drives have, especially ones of the Saturn's kind of period vintage, where it struggles to read burnt CDs, and if you throw a burnt CD in it, it's it can read it, but it works extra hard, which is a death sentence for this sort of thing. But you can emulate this game 100%. We'll go into details a little bit, because you can emulate it. You have to use the European PAL version, because disc swapping on the best emulator you can get for the Saturn, which is Bob?
That would be either Medifin, or if you like RetroArch, you can use Medifin's core there.
And if you can actually use disc swapping with the PAL version, and you can actually get it running, and you can actually play the game all the way through without spending whatever $1 billion you have to do.
Do not use the American version, because for some reason, disc 2 through 4 are not recognized as game CDs on that emulator for some reason.
That's phenomenal.
For those of you who are considering perhaps buying the Japanese version, which is readily available in the Seattle area for around $30, and playing it in a US Saturn for some reason, which I was considering doing and just looking at, YouTube clips or just a physical script on paper. Apparently, Action Replay's 4M Plus, the kind of standard cart people slap in there for playing import games, kind of freaks out on multi-disc Japanese games, of which I don't know if there are a whole hell of a lot of, and Panzer Dragoon Saga is one of them. So that's actually not a viable route either.
When we look at Final Fantasy VII here, and the only reason I'm going to start at Final Fantasy VII is Panzer Dragoon Saga is pretty much held up as the gold standard of RPGs on the Saturn. There's very few that you could argue are better. And contemporary-wise, a lot of people at the time were, if you had a Saturn, you were like, Panzer Dragoon Saga, it's at least as good as Final Fantasy VII. Like that was the game that they would throw at Final Fantasy VII every time someone was like, that kind of thing. So, compared to Final Fantasy VII, what are we sort of looking at with Panzer Dragoon Saga?
I'm thinking between Robotron and Drill Dozer.
I would actually go so far as between Warrior Land 4 and Galaga.
I'm okay with that.
I want to hear from Xerxes, because he's sitting there trying to twiddling his thumbs.
I've not even really played this, so I don't have a lot of skin in this game, but I don't know if I can give you Robotron and Galaga. I just don't know, man.
Yeah, I don't know about that either. I don't.
Don't tell them that you haven't played it. That's really dangerous.
I'm just gonna be straight.
I'm gonna not rank this, but
But I have an opinion. I'm not ranking it.
No. Okay, so my opinion in terms of this is Final Fantasy VII is probably, and I think we may have said this, but I think it was the most important JRPG of 1997. I don't think you can fight that point, like in terms of longevity, in terms of impact.
It's a very influential, important game, and I won't deny that.
I will say this much. The one thing about kind of going for and against Panzer Dragoon Saga is that there was nothing like it before it came out, and really nothing like it since.
That's true.
That's one of my real questions, because what I was thinking was Panzer Dragoon Saga, you can't really... It's never been stolen wholesale, It was a difficult game to sort of create... Because they spent basically, I think, like a year converting Panzer Dragoon into an RPG, and they did a surprisingly good job. Like that was something I read from an interview of the designers, where they were like, okay, we really struggled to make Panzer Dragoon an RPG, but once we got there, then we made the rest of the game, and it does actually show that they spent a lot of effort on it.
Yeah, I'll say like one of the biggest circles on our kind of grid or diagram of rating criteria that we almost never refer to.
I think it's because that has a big circle that says, does Xerxes like it, as one of the main criteria. So,
no, it is actually Xerxes played it when he was a kid, therefore it's good.
Right, yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's but even bigger than that circle, Cal,
yes,
if you must know.
I know.
Is
I know.
one of a kind in a good way.
I think it is one of a kind in a good way. I think that you can't even argue against that.
But I can't in good conscience put it above Final Fantasy VII, even though I think it is mechanically a much more fun JRPG, or like that's the one I would play again. But like the impact that Final Fantasy VII had artistically and otherwise on games since then is staggering.
You can't overestimate it, because we're still feeling Final Fantasy VII today. But
we're still making Final Fantasy VII today. It just keeps happening over
Saga,
and over.
Because Sega hate money. They just have this ability to take money and lose it. Today, like, they still haven't been able to port it. They lost the source code, or someone stole it, or they deleted it, or whatever they did. I don't know. They just went,
it should be noted, some people involved in the making of this game died, if I'm not mistaken, during the process of making it.
Yes.
Two members of the dev team died during the production of this game, and one of them one of them may have killed themselves over stress. I don't know if you want to include that in here, but that's apparently the designer or lead really took this personally. Like, it's like, yeah, no, the pressure of this game was destroying my team when we were making it. Like, the other guy I think died in a motorcycle accident, but whether that's connected or not sure.
One thing, I am kind of sad that more games have not been inspired by this game, because I feel like I would have more respect for the genre if they did. Because
I have to draw out one tangent. This is probably the most accurate representation of how a mecha anime battle would probably work in the RPG battle system I've ever seen, and it's a shame that none of the Xeno games ever bothered to replicate it.
It's kind of like the end of Star Trek II: Wrath of Khan, right, where Kirk outsmarts his enemy because his enemy's from the 21st century and doesn't understand that like spaceship combat functions in 3 dimensions.
Yeah,
I mean, it just manages to recreate that feeling of a high-speed aerial battle. I don't
know if we got properly into that.
Class or some of the Gundam series.
that unlike like most the Final Fantasy VII as an immediate example, most of those battles are pretty much we're standing here and then we hit each other. Whereas some of the battles in Panzer Dragoon, it's like vehicles flying around and the background's whooshing past you and you're swerving shots, and it's really cool. And I think companies, and I think Squaresoft did it, and we looked at it, the games where you actually do target limbs and you have like that sort of, that system is found in Panzer Dragoon Saga. They sort of did
the Vagrant
this.
Story, yeah.
Yeah, Vagrant Story did that. There are other ones that.
Okay, so my final offer here between Alien Soldier and Streets of Rage 2, because right above Alien Soldier is Alien Soldier is Alien Soldier, which is I think, but right above that is Kicks, Final Fantasy VII, Metroid.
Yeah, well, I think the question is, I think it is an important one, is, is Panzer Dragoon Saga as a game, because it didn't influence almost anything, I don't think, and that's probably because it sold like half a dozen copies, and that's because they only made that many, but it's just like, there are some issues with it that are kind of rough-edged that we did mention, and it hasn't aged super great in places. The FMVs, unfortunately, kind of aged the game more than you would think, because they kind of look really silly.
They actually look, man, despite the fact that they have more expressive faces than, say, Final Fantasy VIII, which came out the same year, the FMVs actually managed to look worse than the one at the start of the first Panzer Dragoon.
They did the lighting really not great. I think it's because they rendered so many of these that they just didn't have time to do the amount of passes that you would do on a like a 10-second, 1-minute intro. They had to just churn these things out, and it didn't work in their favor. Okay, so Alien Soldier, I know some of you guys want to push this one higher. I don't know. I like Saga quite a lot, but its influence has not reverberated through games in any sort of conceivable fashion. Also, I'm kind of bothered that Sega just dumped this one and never really. They did Orata, but.
Well, the Curse. Don't forget the Curse.
Yeah, the Curse. So
you would be afraid to touch it too.
I mean, just the brain drain alone from that. Like, that studio didn't do a whole hell of a lot else after this, really. Like, it's kind of
Andromeda was disbanded, and then they partially became Small Byte, and then I don't know what Small Byte did after.
Okay.
Yeah.
Between Final Fantasy VII and Kicks. No, or between Kicks and Alien Soldier. How about that?
That's too low. I'm sorry.
It's got to be underneath Kicks. It's got to be underneath Kicks.
It's underneath Kicks?
Kicks is Kicks.
Okay, between Metroid and Final Fantasy, final offer.
Bob really, really prefers this over Final Fantasy VII, and that's, I can understand that. They're kind of so distinctly separate. One, like, Final Fantasy VII is kind of beaten down by virtue of the fact that it has been reused and reformatted something like 1,000 times.
It's got a real big target on it.
But on that note, people don't look to Panzer Dragoon Saga and say, all right, I really want to do this game again, even though they should, but they don't. Final Fantasy VII has this thing that was kind of like, okay, we figured it out, we did it. Everyone's just going to take this game and keep making this game. I do think that Panzer Dragoon Saga, if you were to remake this game as Final Fantasy VII is getting a remake, it would probably be better, I think. Like, I really think if you were to remake this game, you could kick the shit out of Final Fantasy VII.
It is, like, from a gameplay standpoint, better and more fun than Final Fantasy VII. I'm just saying Final Fantasy VII is like, it's just too. So, this is coming from somebody who does not really like Final Fantasy VII. I like things about it a lot more than I like the game itself.
I think Final Fantasy VII is probably sitting slightly more accessible. Panzer Dragoon Saga is a little bit trickier to get into. I mean, that's a good thing and a bad thing. But
what makes a JRPG is telling a story, is presenting memorable characters, telling a story artistically. It's not just the battle system. The battle system in Final Fantasy VII is passable, but there's other things that this genre does normally.
I do think that
that's fair.
While they tried so hard to, and they succeeded and told a very nice, very sort of condensed, and also a slightly personal story with Saga. I can't remember anyone in this game. I mean, they look good sometimes, but
I'm okay with below Quicks. I Kicks.
I don't dispute the case.
Well, I don't really
settles it.
see why
We've
it
gone
gets
on
kicked below
way
kicks,
too long.
but if that's what we're doing, that's
Because
what we're doing.
kicks is kicks. It is.
Why you keep saying that? But kicks is not.
It's the game that launched 1,000 clones.
We don't even remember what we said about kicks, to be fair.
Fortix.
I do.
I know it's kicks. It's what? All right, fine. You know, just put it below kicks. I don't mind. Kicks inspired a whole range of strip porno games, so fine.
Exactly.
Kicks can stay there. Whatever.
Case in point.